Hello everyone, I'm happy to welcome you to today's session of this NPTEL course Indian Fiction in English. Here we are again looking at the stellar work by Amitav Ghosh, The Shadow Lines, a work published in the year 1988 and a winner of awards including the Sahitya Academy Award. And we also have noticed how acclaimed, how popular this work has been since the moment of its publication. This could be seen as yet another momentous event after Rushdie's Midnight's Children, so much so that a set of writers who followed the same style of writing and imitated the similar thematic style, they came to be known as the Ghosh generation. I assume that by now you are more familiar with this text, that you've either completed reading this novel or you are halfway through, because it is extremely important in understanding the discussions which are to follow in today's session. And before we begin with a set of themes and a set of trends which are part of this novel, The Shadow Lines, it's important to situate this within the critical genre yet again. As the title implies, The Shadow Lines, this is about a set of arbitrary, invisible lines which are drawn to separate nations, communities and individuals from each other. Ghosh at multiple levels questions the irrationality and the absurdity with which these lines are drawn and how these lines are also used to instigate violence, to justify violence of different kinds. I would like to read to you a very brief description from the blurb of this novel, The Shadow Lines. It says, Amitav Ghosh questions the meaning of political freedom and the force of nationalism in the modern world, exposing the idea of the nation state as an illusion, an arbitrary dissection of people. Ghosh reveals the absurd manner in which your home can suddenly become your enemy. We find that Ghosh plays with this idea of home and the outside at various levels, even the two major sections of this novel, going away and coming home. We find that going away also becomes coming home, and coming home in a sense is also about going away from the self. The titles could have been easily exchanged. So that's the arbitrariness, that's the absurdity of these shadow lines that Ghosh talks about throughout this novel in subtle and also in more direct terms. Apart from this being one of my personal favorites of Indian English fiction, I think one of the enduring things about this novel is that this continues to be relevant. The depiction of violence, the invocations of violence, the references to violence and the various phases of it, it continues to be relevant even today when we are facing different kinds of sectarianism and different forms of fragmentation. Written in the aftermath of the Sikh riots, which was decades back, we realize that the same tone could be applied to talk about various things in the contemporary as well. Most reviewers have also spoken about how Ghosh makes it possible to catapult the reader into different time zones and into different locations. In this novel, through its reading, which is not in a linear way, we realize that we are being taken to three different places, to Calcutta, London and Dhaka. And this travel through these different locations and across time, it's made possible through a series of stories related to us by the narrator, by Ila, characters such as Trid, the grandmother. They all bring together a series of stories which is responsible for making the places and the times alive for us. And this novel also believes in this dictum that we all live in stories. So it's the importance of stories that Ghosh celebrates. He's also bringing to us a set of stories which could not have been told in any other way. The importance of bringing many stories together, that it would also together challenge this grand narrative about the nation and also about the significance of the arbitrariness with which lines drawn across nations and across communities exist in the contemporary world. The way Ghosh depicts violence, it's in a totally different way. He's not interested in a graphic description of violence as a voyeur. It's not in those terms that he talks about violence. There are different phases of violence that he explores in very subtle ways. The marriage between Ila and Nick there's a violence inherent in it in terms of relationships. He also talks about the riot which happens in the streets of Dhaka and Calcutta. I want to draw your attention to the way violence is described in this piece of work. And talking of the day of riots that tore Calcutta apart in 1964, this is the way he describes it. I opened my mouth to answer and I found I had nothing to say. All I could have told them was the sound of voices running past the walls of my school and of a glimpse of a mob in Park Circus. There are no explicit graphic descriptions, but the subtleness of it makes the absurdity of violence, makes the absolute senselessness of violence all the more clear to us. It would not be wrong to say that what Ghosh perhaps tries to highlight here is the absurdity of this entire thing, which is based on a series of arbitrary lines drawn across for various reasons. And he uses some kind of a subtle humor to talk about this as well, that this is very interesting. And there is this instance where the grandmother reacts in a particular way on discovering how her old Jetamoshai is living with a Muslim family in Dhaka. We find some serious humor at work over here, and we can not be but amazed by the way in which Ghosh is able to infuse a subtle humor into this otherwise grave situation. I read to you from this instance. She exchanged a look of amazement with Maya Devi. "Do you know," she whispered to Robbie, "there was a time when that old man was so orthodox that he wouldn't let a Muslim's shadow pass within 10 feet of his foot. And look at him now, paying the price of his sins." 10 feet, Robbie explained to May in hushed whisper, marveling at the precision of the measurement. "How did he measure?" he whispered back at my grandmother. "Did he keep a tape in his pocket when he ate?" No, my grandmother said impatiently. In those days, many people followed rules like that. They had an instinct. "Trigonometry," Robbie cried in a triumphant aside to May. "They must have known trigonometry. They probably worked it out like a sum. If a Muslim is standing under a 22-foot building, how far is his shadow? You see, we are much cleverer than you. Bet your grandfather couldn't tell when a German's shadow was passing within 10 feet of his foot." This is a hilarious situation. But the humor evoked over here, it is also indicating the centuries-old injustice which were prevalent in different parts of the world, in different cultures. It is talking about how, in spite of the arbitrariness of these divisions, the hierarchy which is practiced in different societies, the attitudes to different beings which are lower in the rung, they remain pretty much the same. Just as a Muslim is ostracized, we find a German Jew also being ostracized in the European setting, which is being invoked over here. Khushwant Singh, one of the important writers and critics of our times, he has said this about shadow lines. This is how the language should be used. This is how a novel should be written. Much as it is difficult in these days to give such claims about how a novel should be written, Ghosh uses a kind of language which is extremely impeccable. Ghosh's use of language is hard to miss. It continues to amaze as well as instruct us. I read to you this distinction that he brings about between knowledge and ignorance. He knew the clarity of that image in his mind was merely the seductive clarity of ignorance, an illusion of knowledge created by a deceptive weight of remembered detail. Look at the beauty of the diction over here and how it blends quite seamlessly with the many serious, profound things that he discusses as part of this work, The Shadow Lines. Much as we are attentive to the many critical insights as part of this novel, it's hard to miss the fact that this is one work which has been accepted and widely acclaimed by writers and critics from across the world. There is a certain coherence to this work which brings us together to engage with this in a more inclusive and in a more personal way. And many critics and reviewers have also spoken about how this is one novel which has stayed with them long after the pages have been turned. And that's a rare feat in today's terms. Of course, there are many things that Ghosh is not attentive to. He's not attentive to the different kinds of violences which are part of caste divisions. He are not attentive to the many articulations of gender differences. Nevertheless, he has managed to reach the heart of the matter by looking at the shadow lines which divide one nation from the other as perhaps the root of all of those sectarian and divisive tendencies in the first place. Shadow lines being one work that has been worked on by critics of different stature. It's important to take a look at the different frameworks within which this is situated. For that purpose, we also have two presentations coming up today, where two of our students will be sharing with you some of the critical insights that they have gained in the context of reading the shadow lines. Sridhar and later Sibi will be talking to you about the many facets and the many themes which make shadow lines one of the best stories ever told in the context of narrating this nation in Indian fiction in English. I welcome these presenters, and I also hope you will get a better understanding of this novel in the light of these discussions. I also strongly encourage you to continue reading this novel and pay attention to the different segments which are being discussed over here as part of these presentations. Thank you.
I'm presenting on Shadow Lines. It's a novel by Amitav Ghosh. It was published in 1988. It won the Sahitya Academy Award in 1989. So Amitav Ghosh, he was born in Calcutta in 1956. His narratives that he uses in his novels are usually cosmopolitan in nature. His family originates from East Bengal and they migrated to Calcutta before the partition. He grew up in Calcutta and later he studied in Delhi and in the US. So we find Western ideals in him, yet he remains culturally rooted. So this kind of almost exactly superimposes on our novel's narrator. Ghosh has his own struggle to find space to balance his cosmopolitan ideals with the cultural legacy that he has. So with relation to the cosmopolitan ideas, we see Ghosh characters, even when they are non-Indians, there are no false notes that are stuck because their emotions as well as passions, they are related to the universal humanity rather than their racial identity. So people might agree or disagree whether this is right or wrong, but turns out this is his viewpoint. And as for the characters, so when I read the novel, I managed to put some faces on each of the characters. So I'm adding those faces because it might be easier for the imagination for this presentation. Because it's in a span of 20 minutes, you won't be able to make up faces for the characters. Only the main characters have been mentioned. So this is the narrator. He's a Calcutta middle class boy. He was born and brought up in Calcutta, and he moves to Delhi to do his masters and moves to London to do his doctorate. And then there's Ila. She's a daughter of a UN official and therefore has to travel around a lot. She considers her lifestyle choices to be not so much in tandem with the Indian cultural norms. And then there is Thamma. She's a very hardworking woman. She's self-made. She has very strict principles, and she's a school principal, and she's also a kind of a traditionalist. There is Tridib. Tridib is the son of Shayab and Mahadevi. Maya Devi is Thamma's sister. So in a way, Tridib is narrator's uncle. He was in England during the Second World War, and he has a doctorate in archaeology. He stays in Calcutta, and there is Robi, who's a typical tough guy. He is Tridib's younger brother, and but he is young enough to hang out with the narrator Anila, who is kind of a generation below him. He goes by the book. And he's respected for that. He goes by his motto, like never question the rules, just live by them. So naturally, Thamma loves Robi. There is May, who is Tridib's love. She is pen pals with him. She later visits India. She works for some charity organization. And there's Nick Price, who is May's younger brother, and he is Ila's love. He's kind of a very ambitious guy. He does chartered accountancy and wants to start up businesses. So getting into the main topic of this presentation, it's time. So when you talk about time in this generation, we see the philosophy that is dominant in this generation is to live life in the present. There is a detachment from history that we see, as well as we tend to feel this, have no expectations for the future. So people say this is a true reflection of the postmodern society. In Ghosh's shadow line, there is a simultaneous time and not a sequential structure that you see. Ghosh creates a gap in the narrative and then goes on to fill the gap as the novel moves along. I'm not talking about the details when I talk about gaps, but rather the story that lies beyond the details. So the fiction starts at a place, for example Calcutta, and then seems to be disjoint. There are multiple narration by characters. For example, Thama's Dhaka stories, in which she lived in a small house with her sister as well as her parents and her father's brother. And there are Tridip's wartime stories, in which he was in England during the Second World War and when the Germans were bombing it. And then there is Roby's riot story, which happened in Dhaka during the 1960s. And then there is Ila, her story about the racism that she faced when she was in England. So this inevitably leads to the multiplicity of time and place that happens in the novel. For example, there is Thama, who I mentioned is a school principal. We see Thama before retirement as well as after retirement and how the time treats her. And we see Ila before her and after her marriage. So this narration, this complex of it culminates as a complete whole, and that has to be owed to the mastery of Ghosh here. We are also fed history through all these stories. For example, as I mentioned earlier, Thama's Dhaka, which is in the late 19th century. And then there is Tridip's England during the Second World War, which is beginning of 20th century. And there is 60s Calcutta, and there is 60s Dhaka, and there is the 80s England that we see finally. So the changes with time for the fiction is also mentioned. For example, when Thama repeats Dhaka after nearly some 50 years, she keeps on asking, where is Dhaka? Throughout the trip. She keeps on repeating it to everybody. So that's about it for time. And as for space, there is a French sociologist called Marc Auge. So he defines anthropological place as something that can be defined as relational, historical and concerned with identity. So narrator, Ila, Tridip, almost all of the characters fall in different spatial realm in this novel. And therefore, it's obvious that they possess different identities, as opposed to say like a married couple living in Calcutta. Like say the narrator's parents, their identities kind of fall in tandem with each other. So this place is defined in opposition to non-place, which is the concept of which cannot be defined as relational historical concern with identity, and it is kind of devoid of emotion and memory. So places have history, and we associate that place, we associate that history with the place when we call it by its name. For example, Tridip is a very imaginative character. He tells stories about, he devotes his time to reading geographies from far away, and since he is a doctorate in archaeology, he would obviously do that. And he mentions all these stories to the narrator. So when the narrator visits London, he is excited by the idea because he is viewing London through Tridip's eyes. So this is a place for him because it has the history that's associated with his identity. In contrast to that, we have non-places which have no present, past or future. They are always the same. For example, the roadside tea shops that the narrator mentions in Calcutta. No matter what, they don't change, they are just there. They don't have any history associated with them. So this idea of place and non-place comes into play when Tridip says to May, that I mentioned, the pen pals here. So he says, I want you to meet you as a stranger in a ruin. He wants to meet her in a non-place, which he means free from relatives, a place without a past, without a culture. So this is a free place where two people in love come together. And another instance would be the Tube, which is the underground train service in London. So this place for the narrator is a very exciting one because it has the history as well as the stories for him that are associated with it even before he came to London. But for Ila, who has been in London for a very long time, it is a non-place. She just says it's a bloody underground. So with that, we also come to the idea of home as a huge part of the identity of these characters. Home is also, by the definition of the Hugh, this is also a place. For example, Jetamoshai, who is Thamma's father's brother, so when he is asked to taken back from Dhaka to India, he says, I don't believe in India Shindia, but suppose you get there and they decided to draw another line somewhere. So what will you do? You also see that when Thamma visits Dhaka, since she is traveling by airplane for the first time, she is not very much knowledgeable about the forms and everything that goes into it. So she doesn't know the difference between frontiers and borders. So she believes when she crosses Dhaka, there would be a line, a big line, which she knows that she is crossing India and going into East Pakistan. However, I mean, that's obviously not the case. She comes to know that she has to fill in birthplace when she has to go to East Pakistan. And because of her birthplace is Dhaka, she has to fill in Dhaka. So she goes into the crisis as to what does it make her? Does it make her Indian or not? Also, we find Ila, the girl, who moves away from the cultural boundaries here. So she wants to define what her home is and what she is comfortable with and what culture does her home has to be so that it doesn't bind her in. So many symbolic metaphors have come in this novel. For example, the partitioning borders is obviously a huge part with relation to space, because Thamma's Dhaka home, her father as well as his brother are lawyers, and when a dispute happens between the two families, previously they used to live together in a home, and then there is a dispute. So the lawyers decide to divide the home very rationally so that their families are separate, and the house was divided exactly in half, and it even cuts through a toilet, and she never spoke to her cousins after that, and the playing with them also stopped. So I mean, the metaphor here comes when she says to her sister about how she had no idea how the other side was, because they have been separate for a very long time. I mean, her sister is Maya Devi, and since she is very young, Thamma used to tell stories to her about how the other side is an upside down place where they start with dinner first and they end with breakfast, and Jetamoshai will shout because he has to have his breakfast in his bathroom, and he would such like that. And this is a metaphor because, and this kind of becomes a metaphor for the partitioning and borders that happen, because suddenly, I mean, at one time you are a subcontinent and the next day you are a different country. So the reality aspect also comes in without the metaphor part. For example, the border states that come in the novel. The narrator's father, when Thamma is leaving for Dhaka, the narrator's father is Thamma's son. So he asks, what did you expect? Did you expect a long black line with green on one side and scarlet on the other, just like you see on the school atlas? It isn't like that. But however, curiously, Thamma isn't offended, but she's rather confused that isn't the way it is, even though she's a school principal and all. So with this idea of space, to counter it, we have stories and imagination in the novel. So imagination is powerful enough to disavow all the spatial and temporal borders in the novel and open up a lot of cosmopolitan possibilities. Tridib, the imaginative guy, he uses his education to aid his imagination, and it is a personal liberation for him that way. And cosmopolitanism as an idea is delimited by the stories that we live in. Our lives are more or less the stories that we tell to each other. So in that way, Shadow Lines is a story about stories. The stories in this novel is webbed together in such a manner that when a detail of one story is revealed, it affects the other stories surrounding it also. For example, the narrator, spoiler, but obviously Tridib gets killed. So it took him 15 years to discover that there was a connection between his nightmare bus ride back from school, which was the communal rides in Calcutta, and the events that befell Tridib and others in Dhaka, which was the same communal ride at the same time in Dhaka. The imagination here is useful in carrying oneself beyond the limits of one's mind to other time and places, just as the narrator did in case of Tridib. So another example would be when Ila says to the narrator, they are in London and it's a vault and both of them are to sleep there, and she says, here we are back in Rajbajar. Rajbajar is a place back in Bengal where she and the narrator used to play together. So it's a metaphorical reference. And also we see the narrator knowing London too well, even though he has never visited it. Just because Tridib has told him stories about London all along, like what street the Price family live in, what street do you find the museum, and stuff like that. An important metaphor which the novel ends is essential in understanding the meaning of distance is both real and constructed, and national frontiers, as the narrator calls, looking glass borders. So the narrator finds, once Tridib is dead, he finds a compass as well as the Bartholomew's map of Tridib. He knows that, the riot that happened was because there was a Prophet Muhammad's hair in Kashmir which went missing. So that resulted in a riot in Dhaka as well as in Calcutta. So, and that was the reason Tridib got killed in the communal riot there. So he takes the compass as well as atlas. You could see it here. He places it on Dhaka and then stretches the compass to Kashmir. And then with that as a radius, he just draws a circle and realizes that it covers almost a lot of China and Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, and goes a full round. And then he says, what about what happened in China or Indonesia? Why don't people care about that? Why does it have to be this? So there are lines, he says that these are lines that make the stories of people different that they actually ought to be. The artificial divisions that we find, just like the Jetamushai's house in Dhaka. This is true especially in the case of the Bengal religion, because all are Bengal people. The West Pakistan even detested the East Pakistan because of its Bangla culture. But ever since partition, they are entirely different people, as they say. And many borders even run through homes. And if you are familiar with the idea of enclaves with the border, you will see that India and East Pakistan border usually go up to the third order. As you see here, this is a piece of India which is in Bangladesh, which is in India, which is in Bangladesh, which is insane. And coming back to the characters, Tridib, with his imagination, he represents the openness to space and place. May was there when Tridib got killed in that communal violence. He talks about the mystery of the sacrifice that went along with it. So, you see, this is a communal riot which was boosted by the boundedness of the national narrative, which ended up killing Tridib, who stands as a symbol of cosmopolitan imagination. So again a metaphor. So amongst these dark lines, Ghosh tries to find a space between cultures. So I'll go into the women of the novel, because the role that women of this novel, the role that they play is quite a lot. Though the narrator narrates, the story isn't about him. It's a story about how the narrator's consciousness is shaped by the relating with the woman in his life. However, the story isn't about the women either. It is merely this guy telling the story of those women. The perspective is quite well established. So that might be the one of the reason I can connect to the narration. So there are other characters, no other characters with the exception of Tridib are fully formed with the third dimension, except for these three women in the novel, Tama, Ila and May. Tama and Ila stand for certain things, as you can see through the novel, which is one of the reasons why their characters seem to have very strong foundation. Tama is a nationalist and a traditionalist, while Ila is a free-spirited girl who couldn't care less for the above. And there's Tama whose motto is be strong enough to face what comes at you, and Ila is choose what comes at you. Tama calls Ila a whore and Ila calls Tama a fascist. The narrator kind of stands between them both and trying to place these two people with relation to their opinion as well as the opinion of the other. He seems to be defending Tama when he is talking to Ila, and defending Ila when he is talking to Tama, because both have a very radical opinion about each other. There are name calling too, as I mentioned earlier. So, however, both of these characters are limited in adopting two things. Tama is limited by her own very strong ethical principles, which is very obvious when she visits Dhaka. And Ila is limited by her very own concept of freedom, because when because I told about how Ila married Nick, the British guy, and when she finds Nick cheating on her, she couldn't take it because she isn't quite used to things going not the way that she planned to. So May, however, represents a view that's away from the Orientalist view with which we think British view India, and yeah, that would be it. These are references.
Good morning to everyone present here. My name is Sibi and I'm here to present on The Shadow Lines by Amitav Ghosh. Moving on to the novel, The Shadow Lines provides a perspective of time and events, of lines that bring you together and hold you apart, of lines that exist in the memory of the narrator. Therefore, it invites a reader to join the narrative and correlate with the incidents happening in the novel and the actual events that were taking place during that time in India. Amitav Ghosh tries to use a special device here called the mirroring, where he considers the mirror to be a shadow line between the reader and the characters in the novel, and they tend to reflect ideas on one of each other, of their own on each other. Ghosh questions the real question of political freedom in this novel, and also and this novel spreads across a span of 70 years that covers many movements in India and events in India, such as the Swadeshi movement, the partition of India, and the communal riots that happened in the 63 and 64. The first theme, love for homeland. It is very clear that Tamma and her dad's brother Jatamoshai, who is and their love for their homeland, they decided to never move from their homeland. And also, even when Tamma's husband dies, she doesn't move away from her home in search of a livelihood. And she also criticizes Ila for going to an alien land, saying she has no right to live there, she doesn't belong there. It took those people a long time to build that country. This shows how Tamma is very serious about how one should never leave their homeland, no matter what the situation is, as long as and as well as Tamma's dad's brother Jatayoshi, when Tamma and Maya Devi, the sisters, visit to go to Dhaka to take their to bring back their uncle to Calcutta, he tells them that he wouldn't move anywhere from his homeland, and he told the same thing to his sons as well. He told them that he doesn't believe in the India's India. It's all very well, you're going away now, but suppose when you get there, they decide to draw another line somewhere, what will you do then? Where will you move to? No one will have to move anywhere. As for me, I was born here and I will die here. Then you could also call this novel a historical novel, because it deals with such historical events and is closely associated with them. It depicts the modern history of India, such as the Calcutta, the communal wars, the partition, and the Swadeshi movement. Violence is another striking theme in the novel, because violence is not directly portrayed in the form of words, but Ghosh chose to not use words, rather than disguise it in the narrative structure to make the violence more effective. He states that he doesn't even have words to describe the manner in which Tridip's death occurred. Migration is another postmodern theme that Ghosh employs in this novel. The characters are constantly shown moving from one place to another, even though the most of the characters are actually not for it. This novel starts with 13 years before the narrator was born. There was also a kind of criticism against the migration in the novel, where Tamma criticizes Ila for going to another country. While she converses with the narrator, her grandson, she states that, "Shall I tell you what Ila has gone for?" And the narrator immediately replies saying she is gone there for money. But she immediately responds to it saying, "It's not for money, it's a thing, it's all things money can buy. Fridges like the one Mrs. Sen's son-in-law bought back from America, with 2 doors and a spout that drops ice cubes into your glass. color TVs and cars, calculators and cameras, all things you can't get here. Ghosh does a good job blending fact and fiction into the novel. In an interview, Ghosh defined his choice of fiction over history, stating that I think fiction has always played that part. If you look at Tolstoy's War and Peace, I think the difference between the history and historians write and the history fiction writers write is that fiction writers write about the human history. It's about finding human predicament. It's about finding what happens to individuals, characters. I mean, that's what fiction, exploring both dimensions, whereas history, the kind of history exploring causes, causality is of no interest to me. Communal difference is another theme that Amitav Ghosh employs. Quoting from the novel, as always, there were innumerable cases of Muslims in East Pakistan giving shelters to Hindus, often at the cost of their own lives, and equally India of Hindus sheltering Muslims. But they were ordinary people, soon forgotten, not for them any martyrs' memorials or eternal flames. And on another occasion, Ghosh criticizes the practice of communal violence through the talks of the narrator's grandmother and a local mechanic from Bengal, and the exchange follows. She asked, the mechanic's name is Saifuddin, and she asked the mechanic, does Khalil's wife cook for him too? Of course, it's Saifuddin. If she didn't cook, the old man couldn't get anything to eat. She exchanged a look of amazement with Maya Devi. Do you know, she whispered to Robbie. There was a time when the old man was so orthodox that he wouldn't let a Muslim shadow pass within 10 feet of his foot. And look at him now paying for the price of his sins. And moving on to nationalism, I found this theme to be the most impactful in the novel because it raises several questions. Amitav Ghosh focuses on the meaning of political freedom and in the modern world, as well as the force of nationalism through the description of various political scenarios such as the communal riots, the partition time, as well as World War II. He not only introduces the concept of nationalism to the readers, but as well questions the validity of the so-called nationalism. He also raises this question that if a nation can be considered a homogeneous entity, but most of the critics as well as the writers of that time answered with a firm no. The incidents that inspired Amitav Ghosh to write this novel was the massacre, the inhuman massacre of the Sikhs during following Indira Gandhi's assassination. Even though this incident is not present in the novel, there are several other incidents in the novel, such as the defilement of the Hazrat Bal shrine in 1964. There are other instances in the novel where the narrator is often with suspicion, and his mindset is poisoned from the very young age, because there was a rumor at that time that the Hindus and Muslims contaminated and poisoned each other's water supply to kill the members of the other community. There was another key moment in the narrator's life when he visits New Delhi to find out what happened to his uncle Tridib. Although he visits to every place and every museum and every memorial to find out any news about his uncle, he doesn't find anything about this. So Amitav Ghosh tries to show that the history of a nation can swallow up the story of an individual. Through the narrator's growth from childhood to adulthood, Ghosh has shown that a national border is just a mirage. And also when he mocks his grandmother asking if the lines that separate two nations are black in color, she says, of course not, but surely there is something. Trenches perhaps, or soldiers or guns pointing at each other, or even just barren strip of land. Don't they call it no man's land? And in 1964, when she plans to visit Dhaka, somewhere where she would be able to see the borders between India and East Pakistan from the air. With her experience of the traumatic events of the partition, the grandmother's experience, and the grandmother is forced to realize that such borders are just a mirage, and they just separate the two sides of the just a mirror reflecting each other, as well as the realization. In a sense, she gets she ultimately still refuses to believe that borders and demarcation will not affect the society in any way, and she finds reasons to make herself believe, saying that but if there aren't any trenches or anything, how are people to know? I mean, what's the difference then? And if there is no difference, both sides will be the same. It will just be like it used to be before. When we used to catch a train in Dhaka and get off in Calcutta, the next day without anybody stopping us, what was it all for then? Partition and all the killing and everything, if it isn't something in between. She tries to fool herself thinking that the borders will actually make a difference, but Amitav Ghosh leaves us with this question, and I found this excerpt by the grandmother to be the most impactful and heartbreaking, because she is not able to, she understands the situation exactly as it is, but still tries to fool herself thinking everything is fine in the world. These are my references.